Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the SAIEE Nuclear Chapter's latest webinar, the Study Committee on Nuclear Energy. Before we start, a few webinar considerations. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on their device. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the questions panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with attendees. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other, however, are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the SAIEE YouTube channel, SAIEE TV, under the SAIEE Nuclear Chapter playlist. This channel is updated regularly, so ensure check back as often as possible for new uploads. And please click on the link that will appear in the chat box shortly to subscribe to the SAIEE TV channel. It's free. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few weeks after this webinar once we have received the CPD validation number from EXA. I'd like to introduce you now to our host and our first presenter, Professor David Nichols. Professor Nichols was appointed as the chairperson of the board of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation in January 2020. Prior to his retirement at the end of December 2018, he was the chief nuclear officer at Eskom. Internationally, Mr. Nichols was the chairman of the IAEA Technical Working Group on Light Water Reactors from 2010 to 2016, and is currently the co-chair of the IAEA Technical Working Group on Nuclear Power Plant Operations. He was a member of the WANO's post-Fukushima design review team from 2012 to 2018, and he is also the chairman of the SAIEE Nuclear Chapter. I'd like to now hand you over to Prof. Nichols.
Sorry, technology is beating me, folks. I apologize in advance for that. Is my screen visible? Is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Good, okay. Right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The plan is to put forward a presentation of why nuclear is the solution for South Africa. And so I'll climb straight into it. So what I want to cover is 4 key items, which is the needs of South African economy for grid power. Why is nuclear a major element and the only credible solution? The nuclear economics of South Africa, and is it a credible option and can it be financed? Because everyone says, yes, nice idea, but we can't finance it, it doesn't work in time. So let's try and go through those things quite quickly. And the first one is quite simply where do we stand with the energy situation, and this is a very simple graph. It just shows you from 1982 to 2018 what Eskom's peak demand was, and that's the yellow line, which ends up at 35,301 megawatt in 2018. And by the way, the figure this year is almost the same. What's interesting in that is that it grew steadily for 25 years, from 82 to 2006. You can see that a nice 3.4% growth line. And if we'd carried on that growth line post 2007, we would now be at 54,000 megawatts or plus 56,000 megawatts this year. What that implies is that between where we are and where we would have been if we carried on the same growth, there is 20,000 megawatts of what's basically baseload heavy industry, which we haven't got because there's no power. And what drove that change, as you can see, these blue bars are the, they're not the same scale, but these blue bars are the stated interruptions that Eskom made at evening peak because capacity had run out. Eskom stopped reporting after 2011, but basically from 2006 onwards, Eskom was curtailing the market. So you may say, but isn't this how the whole world goes? Well, let's just talk about how much impact this has had on the economy. And you may say, but there hasn't been the demand growth. Therefore, there's no point building more baseload power stations because, look, renewables will meet all the needs. And the answer is, this is a graph of the load shedding from 2007. And there you can see is that first bit of load shedding that I showed you just now. and then it restarted in 2014-15, and then we had a recovery. This restarted again. What's interesting is that at no point, even at the highest level of load shedding, we never load shed more than 1% of demand or supply. In other words, it is not a question of saying we can tolerate a few percent of load shedding. You have to have reliable base load to keep the industry going. And so that's fundamentally that you can't just say, well, if I only have 1% load losses, that's okay. That destroys an economy. And you can see that in this quick graph, which comes from Stats SA, which looks at the percentage of the GDP which comes in from mining and manufacturing. Mining is the blue line, and you can see it declining and then collapsing more in that period, 2006 onwards, and sort of stabilizing off now. What's more interesting is manufacturing, which as the percentage was sitting at about 15.5% of GDP, which is quite a good number, should be higher than that. But you can see something happened in 2007, 2008, which caused it to go on going down. And this collapse is lack of investment in industry. This is not the world economy collapsing, and I'll show that in a second. Because this is the world economy. So people will tell you that, look at this blue line. The dark blue line is the OECD countries. And the OECD countries is USA, the European Union, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and so on. And they basically had you can see the 2008 financial crisis coming out here, which caused a small blip, and it leveled off. And so people say, but look, we're only following the same demand curve as the OECD countries, which is true, except we're not an OECD country. An OECD country has unemployment of about 3%. It has inflation of about 2%. It has very stable, and everybody has food. We are very much a developing economy, and this curve here, the light green line, is that of the OECD, of the non-OECD countries, which shows consistent growth. Yes, there was a slight pullback in 2008, but it didn't last. And if you say, well, how does that relate to GDP? Then here is a graph, again, of GDP per head, which you can see nicely South Africa coming post-94, starting to rise up with a very nice recovery. We all know about 2006, things. 2008 occurs, which, yes, was a depression and then we level off, we start falling. And what's interesting is the general emerging and developing country group of countries just continued to grow, had a slight dip in 2008, but that wasn't long-standing, and they're now taking it. So back in this year, next year, we should be a situation where our GDP per head is below the average developing country, unlike being markedly higher in the past. And just to reinforce this is a quick plot of energy consumption per capita versus per capita GDP, and a very nice curve fit shows you where we stand. And South Africa is somewhere down here. I can't find it, but I will in a second. I can't. Around here somewhere. There's Russia, UK, Switzerland. But clearly, the idea that you grow without energy demand. So, very simple discussion. The lack of baseload and the lack of electricity, abundant electricity for the grid from 2008-6 onwards has caused the economy to contract, and there was a very clear correlation between energy consumption and the GDP per head, which is a key driver. And it can be argued that that was a function of the discussions of stopping Eskom from building stations in the late 1990s. But this is not going to get any better, because this is a stacked graph which you may have seen before, which simply stacks up all the Eskom stations, Arnott, Camden, Dura, Hendrina, Kendall, with Koeberg as the black line on the top, which if you assume a 50-year life for Eskom's coal stations, 60 years for Koeberg, which is what we're currently planning on, and the 50-year life is pretty much supported by the current operating performance of our grid system. You can see that in the performance of the older stations. What you can see is that we're going to grow in capacity to about now, and then it will just keep falling, and falling pretty fast. And it's falling. And why did it grow? Because Medupi and Kasili came in. They've been unreliable. but that will be fixed over time because that happened to all the new stations. And the collapse is because of decommissioning old stations, Cuttflay, Endrina, Camden, and so on being shut down, Kamati. And what you can see is that the South African grid, not having had a situation where from 2006 to 2000 and the present date has had no increasing capacity to feed big industry, what we're now seeing is that it will not only not increase, but it will start declining dramatically over the next decade and a half. And that's the exact opposite, of course, what happened back in the 1980s. We were building as a utility at an amazing rate. What's done in GDP? Very simple. If you do a curve fit, you can end up showing the energy crisis changed our GDP projections, and our GDP will be about 30% higher than it is now if we hadn't had the energy crisis in 2008. So I hope that's very quickly, and I would leave time for questions, because clearly our questions at the end of this. We'll do the 3 presentations first, and then we'll do the questions afterwards. What do we need for grid power? Well, nowadays, reliable and economic have always been the case. You need to be available, you need to be plentiful, you now need to be low carbon. And so you may say, but surely low carbon is and I'll talk about low carbon for a bit, because the solution is clearly going to be another solution. This is just an interesting graph, which comes from, you can see the reference on the page. Where do we stand in the world? What you can see quite nicely is that South Africa is catastrophically the leader of the pack. We're worse than Poland, India, Indonesia, Australia. Nowhere near the good guys, which is Norway, Sweden, France, New Zealand, Brazil, Canada, Belgium. So if we believe that global warming is an issue, which I believe it is certainly a carbon constrained issue, we have to go for a low carbon solution in this country. We cannot just go on burning coal, much as we have plenty of coal. And then you might say, well, okay, but how does this actually work in the world? And what this graph here is showing is a plot, an hourly plot. Each of these spots on this graph is a 1 hour point for the year 2020. So there's 8,760 plots per country. And it just plots the grams CO2 equivalent versus the megawatt produced in that hour. And what is really interesting about this graph is that you can see that the certain countries, and I'll try and go through them and I'm able to read them well. The blue down here is France. So a wide range of power production from the lowest power demand, which probably was a summer's day in a Sunday in summer, midday, coming down at about 35,000 megawatts to a peak of about 85,000 megawatts, always with low carbon. Other extreme, you've got Poland up here, very similar to Eskom, a bit smaller in terms of demand, so peak demand 20,000 megawatts in their case, but all sitting up here because Poland is fundamentally a coal-fired country. What's really interesting is the rest of them. Down here, you've got Norway and Sweden. And Norway is entirely hydro. Sweden is basically half hydro, half nuclear. You've got the small countries here, but you've got the so-called successful countries that are going for a low carbon solution. This big lump in the middle is Germany. This is France. Peak demand's about the same, but the reality is that Germany is a much greater CO2 emitter than France is. Not just mildly much down, but you can see the average is about 40 versus the average being about 400. 10 times worse, despite all the money they're putting in. This is Italy. Again, largely natural gas. Spain down here. Belgium's down here. Belgium will move up dramatically because they're presently half nuclear. Denmark, when you say about Denmark, and that's that little one up here that goes right up to here and right down to here. It essentially is a swing state. It takes power from the rest of the international grid. When the wind is not blowing, it's taking Polish power in. So the solution does not appear to be a policy that has been followed by the Germans or the Danes. What we do know is how it's been done in the world, and it's very simple. There are 8 places on Earth with large grids with very low carbon emissions, and these are the 8 big ones, and they are fundamentally either large hydro or large nuclear. There's France, which is the leading one. The brown is nuclear. The blue is hydro in the south of France in the Alps, and they've got some fossil, some wind and so on. Quebec is entirely hydro. Ontario is 2/3 nuclear, hydro, and a bit of the rest of it, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. None of these are succeeding at being low emission countries by being renewable. Other point, just quickly, is clearly that what's the cost of these things, and what's interesting is a European one, 2015, but it hasn't changed. If anything's got worse, and you can see a projection. If you plot installed wind and solar capacity per capita versus the price of power to the residential customers, the 2 people who stand out as being expensive are the Germans and Denmark, and quite simply down here you've got the more traditional suppliers down here. Seems to be a correlation between the more renewables, the more price. So, having put that on the table, what do our economics in this country look like? And I'm going to put, this is probably the main part of the talk, because I'm going to try and go through it a little bit slower now, because to explain what we've done here. We put together a model of actual ESCOM hourly load in August 2006. And you might say, why did I choose 2006 for the hourly load? And the answer is 2006 is the last time when ESCOM's sent out demand was unaffected by massive constraints of unavailability of power. In other words, we went load shedding in 2006. ESCOM started curtailing mode from 2006 onwards. So that's the hourly load. That's an absolute number. The performance for the renewables was based on, I happen to have August 2016. It hasn't changed since then. I'll show you the graph in a second, of what actually over the August 2016, what was the performance of wind and solar. And this was done in terms of the percentage of installed capacity producing any one hour. So with those, and we assumed this model assumes only grid gas-fired combined cycle gas turbines, wind and PV. The point where the least cost power puts us, according to people. Peak demand in August 2006 was 34,735 megawatts of the ESCOM system. The model assumes that you've got to have at least 15% of your grid provided by synchronized equipment, i.e. rotating machinery, to provide stability. 15% is a number no one's ever got down to in a large grid, but it's probably the low end of what you have to have as rotating machinery to maintain grid stability. I've assumed $12 a kilowatt for combined cycle gas turbine, $10 natural gas, 55% efficiency. OPEX per year per kilowatt, $20, which is a world thing. Cost of wind and cost of PV have both been put in at 60 cents a unit, which even at the moment is quite a low number. People claim it's the new number, but no one's quite bidding at that. The discount rate, which I'll come back to as quite important, is 8.2%. That's what's assumed in the IRP. And the rand dollar, 14 to 1. So given those numbers, what do you start seeing? Well, this is the graph of what you see. The black line is the ESCOM, is the actual demand on the system. You can see quite clearly the daily profile, and you can also see the weekly profile. That's a Saturday and Sunday, that's Saturday and Sunday, and so on. Exactly standard stuff. What you've then got is in this particular model, and we ran the model on several different variants, but this model here, you could end up, we see what is produced by the renewables in that hour. And then the blue line is how much of the renewables you curtail. Because clearly at this point, you can't do more. This energy here is not usable because nobody wants it. We haven't modeled storage here, but again, even now, battery storage is very expensive and makes it significantly more expensive than I'll show you in a second. So that's how the model works. This is a subset just of a smallness of 1 week period. You can see the weeks profile, you can see the renewables coming up and down. What's interesting is to say is that although you've got a model, and I'll show you in a second the numbers, where you've got an enormous amount of way more than installed capacity, way more than demand, this is what the backup generation is running. So the gas turbines are running that profile over the month. They peak out at about 32,000 megawatts, minimum about 4,000 megawatts. They never go to zero, because if they go to zero, the grid would become unstable because there'll be no stability. Synchronization wouldn't be maintained on the grid. So what do the results look like for this thing? Okay, the models we put together had wind at 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 55,000 megawatts installed wind. We assumed 15,000 megawatts of PV just to do a quick reality check. The load factor of the gas turbines. Now, given you've only got just enough gas turbines, this is not it ignores any reserves you may have to have. What you can see here is that the amount of system load, even with extreme amounts of renewables, you've still got 30% load factor on the gas system, and your curtailment is virtually nothing at the low end and steadily rises to 20% at the high end. What the model does is, given those costs we had earlier, it takes for each hour, it works out the expenses in that hour and the overheads, and then you can see therefore the rand per kilowatt hour coming out of this model. So it goes 133, dips down to 123 here, and then goes back at 124. So clearly the optimum is somewhere around here, around 45,000 to 15,000 megawatts, which is the one that we are using as the reference, 123. And what is interesting is that this is, and it will become clear obvious, this model is, I said, running at 8.2% discount rate, and it comes out at £1.23, which is not far away from where the current IRP is putting it in some ways. If you change the discount rate down to 5%, which is a more realistic one for a utility system than the IRP used, then it comes down from 123 to 117. In large part because the renewable energy options are stick at 60 cents. And the reason it's at 60 cents is because they already have involved low-cost financing with a discount rate well below 8.2%. So that's interesting. That tells us that £1.17, which is in my view about where we stand with the IRP. Not quite a bit more than that, but it's in that kind of region. What happens if we put nuclear in exactly the same model? So here's a model where I've just put nuclear in on the same basis. That is, it just runs, load follows. Nuclear can load follow. It can change load quite fast if it really has to. So run what the French grid does with load following. And what you can see is this, that if you take $6,000 a kilowatt, which is an expensive nuclear station, an 8.2% discount rate, you get 1.49 rand per kilowatt hour. So clearly nuclear does not make sense. Even at $4,500 a kilowatt at 8.2%, it doesn't make sense. At 3,500, it starts making sense. This aligns roughly to the IRP assumptions, which says at 8.2%, nuclear has to get down to $3,500 a kilowatt to be viable. But the reality is 8.2% makes no sense to any economist who actually look at the cost of grid systems. 5% is a much more credible number, and in fact, even 3%. At 5%, you suddenly start seeing that you're coming down to 0.99, 0.8, 0.68. And if you're at 3%, which is actually still high by world funding sort of thing, and $2,500 a kilowatt, which is the cost in the established serial production world. I mean that's the Chinese domestic, the Indian domestic, the Russian domestic, the South Korean domestic. You're down at 0.46 cents compared to the number on the previous page, which had 1.17. The numbers I've assumed is sitting down there. I'm not going to go into those because time is probably against me. So what would appear to be the case is if the discount rate is at 8.2%, then nuclear has to be very good capital cost to make it worthwhile. If you come down to 5%, it becomes a winner, and at 3%, it becomes extremely good. So let's just look at some numbers here. Oh, right, this actually is the ESCOM production, the ESCOM stated numbers of renewable production in this country from 1st of May to 6th of June this year. And again, you can see that the lowest point we reached was 278 megawatts, and the highest we reached was 3754 megawatts. So again, if you can assume that's got to match a grid system, it clearly is going to require something to back it up. And as yet, that would appear to be natural gas, which we haven't got domestically, but let's come back. Let's leave that alone. So the fact we've got more installed capacity in 2016 doesn't really change the answer to the question. People say, but just a second, these numbers for nuclear are stupid because we know nuclear is way too expensive. Well, the Financial Times did an opinion on the Inside Business in 27th of January 2019. Okay, it's a couple of years ago now, but it's still valid. And an Energy Technology Institute, which is an organization backed by government and a number of energy companies, looked at 34 delivered nuclear projects around the world, recent projects. The first of the class in the USA or Europe, yeah, $9,000 to $12,000 a kilowatt. That's the EPRs in France, the first EPR in France, the AP1000 in the States. For various reasons I won't go into, they become horribly expensive and are almost the flagship of expensive nuclear projects. What's really interesting, if you look at the 34, you find only 15% of them came in above $5,500 a kilowatt. 45% came between $5,500 and $3,500 a kilowatt. And 40% were below $3,500 a kilowatt, which would end to say that you should really be looking at using numbers below 5,500 for an average nuclear station in the year. And if you're above $5,500 a kilowatt, you are in the failed state or failed project node, maybe a lot Ambadupi and Gasili. But then they say, well, can you actually raise money? Is there any money to be raised in this? How can we fund these things? And this is a 2016 again, but it's virtually all nuclear projects are backed by state-backed loans to make them build. The Russians are lending the Egyptians $25 billion to finance and build a 5,000 megawatt nuclear plant near Cairo. And what's interesting is they published the interest rate in the Gazette in Egypt at 3% annually. It's in dollars, it's 3% annually, which if you take US inflation for the last 10 years has averaged 2%, means the interest rate, the real interest rate is about 1%. At the moment, the US inflation rate's about 4 or 5% because of their stimulus program. But so essentially it says that there is a real example of a country with a worse credit rating than South Africa's got, getting a 35-year, 35-year loan well below 3% real, which if you think was the bottom line of the previous number. So 8.2% real would imply a US dollar interest rate of something like 10%, which is clearly not what's being offered today at the moment. And by the way, most of these projects being built in Egypt, Bangladesh, across the world, are actually fixed price contracts or firm price contracts. You might say, but surely that with South Africa, we can't get these interest rates. Well, export credit rating finance, Eskom also gets that. For other projects, it's got them from the Madupi projects and otherwise. Hasn't taken one for a nuclear project, though it was offered at different times. What's interesting is if you look here, you can see the interest rate Eskom is currently paid, again, 2018 annual report, 1.58% in yen, 0.78%, 0.62%, okay, 4.73%, 2.5%, that's in rand, 2.37. So what I'm saying is that 3% we just discussed does not seem to be out of line with what Eskom's already getting from export credit agency financing deals, which are the kind of deals that you do for a nuclear deal. So we've gone through the process of looking at these things and saying, can we raise the money? So is it economic? Can we raise the money? And it looks as though it's possible. But is it actually fast enough? Because the key question is nuclear is just too slow to put in place. Everyone says that to us. That to fix the short-term problem, we have to do a rapid do it. Well, this is actually the French example. And in 1971, you can see here, this is the actual date. In 1971, the French initiated their, started building the first 2 units at Fessenheim of their program. That they had at that point got no large light water reactors in the French fleet, none. This is the first 2 they ordered. out of the box. Then the following year, they started to work on 4 more at Bouget. So there we are, 71 start line. 77, the first one came onto stream, and then it ramped up. What is interesting, from a 0 base in France with very large local content, they went from 71 decision point to 88. They installed 50,000 megawatts of plant. And even if you go back, so then if you just map that to today, and it's just an example how it could be done. If you then say 2025 is here, we place the contract 2024, we start work 2026, we would start getting machines online in about 2031, 2032, and we would conceivably, by 2040, if you follow the French example, have 36,000 megawatts of plant online. In other words, you'd have replaced the Co and Eskom coal fleet. So it has been done in France as the way of changing an industry entirely from a fossil fuel. In that case, it was oil based, or coal and oil based, following the the oil crisis of 73, because those 4 stations were ordered initially, and then in 73 they realized they better go and order some more because of the oil crisis. So the real crash program started here. These 2 were built as part of their normal build program. And they were ordering, they were at one point, at some points, commissioning 7,000 megawatts a year. Eskom was never that bad with the coal station. This, you may note, actually is almost a mimic of Eskom's coal fleet construction, only we only hit about 3,000 megawatts at our peak year. And you might say, but that was a one-off example, and surely renewables are doing better and have done better than that, and they're the solution. Well, let's just look at some actual. This is a study in Science magazine in 2016. It's based on, I think, based on the BP energy stats. There's more recent ones done which show the exact same lines. And what that tells you is if you measure how fast you brought a technology on stream over a 10-year period to actually, in terms of kilowatt hours per capita per year added annually, then you get these graphs here. The Chinese, that's the solar and wind. You can see solar is the dark brown, wind is the light brown. And what you can see is these amazing activities here: China, Japan, California, USA, Italy, Germany, Spain, Denmark. And then you come down and say, well, actually they dwarfed over the same time period back in the 70s and the 80s. And in the case of South Korea, 2005, you can see that the nuclear build dwarfed what's been achieved with solar and wind in terms of real numbers on the ground. Of interest, this is France. Sweden did more than they did. Sweden went from having no nuclear to actually having basically most of the grid being nuclear in 10 years. Okay, so my last slide and my key question. So I would argue that nuclear has met the requirements to meet the needs of a modern developing grid. It has been funded across the world. It has met good schedules and good costs. So why is it not on anyone's agenda? And I would argue that we've got a problem that people are looking for an efficient, or are we looking for an efficient solution for the country's needs, or a particularly correct one? And I'll give you 2 quotes from Earthlife, and there are many more quotes out there, but these 2 I think are particularly interesting. The first one is actually on their website, or it certainly was when I downloaded it a few months ago. I haven't checked in the last week, but it states the nuclear energy campaign stands in opposition to the procurement and development of new nuclear power. The construction of a nuclear power plant will mean fewer renewable technologies to be deployed, as well as their delay. The intended outcome of this campaign is to increase the share of renewables to South Africa's energy mix. The underlining is mine. In other words, Earthlife's policy has nothing to do with the environment. It has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with what's the right thing for the country. It is only to support the renewable rollout. And I would argue the aim of the country is to reduce our carbon emissions by whatever means we can, not to just increase our renewable rollout. And the other comment made in April this year by their programs manager is that nuclear is not the answer to climate change. It is completely carbon intensive. I'm not going to do any slides on that, but you will realize that is, present indications are the nuclear is less carbon intensive than the majority of renewables. So, to summarize what I've just been saying, if I pass over to Melly to talk about large nuclear reactors, the basic answer is this country needs to install substantive, dispatchable, synchronous machinery to support our energy needs. And over the next 10 years, it's going to become 10 years from now, it'll become a crisis, a real crisis. We shut down industry because we can't feed them. That solution is got to be a low carbon solution because that's what the world is demanding. The economics of low carbon says that we can do nuclear at a price that is substantially below that is assumed because the assumption of discount rates has nothing to do with reality. But that we then say, why is it so? And we can do it in a speed that meets the needs of the country across the board. And my question would merely remain one of, excuse me, but why is it not on the agenda? And the answer is that it is getting in the way of fashion. It is getting in the way of politically correct. Renewables are the answer, nuclear can't. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you. And I will change across to ask Melly to talk about large nuclear reactors. So Melly is currently a chief engineer in the nuclear energy of the nuclear engineering of ESCOM nuclear operating unit, where he's responsible for research and development and the development of innovative nuclear technologies to support the grid demands of the future. He leads the team that is providing technical support to some of the Coburg power station life extension and special projects. He graduated from the University of Cape Town with a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering, BSc Eng, in 92, and subsequently completed a Master of Science in Engineering, MSc Eng in 2001, with more focus in power systems. So with that, I'll pass across to Melly. Thank you.
Good morning. Morning.
Morning. It's all yours, Melly. Keep going.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. And then is my picture showing? I just want to show it.
Yeah, you're shown well. Keep going. You're fine.
Okay.
Modern
thank
science.
you, Dave.
You see,
Okay,
nuclear engineering is not rocket science. It's all way in the past.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I'm the chairman of the Energy Study Committee or the Nuclear Chapter, South African Institute of Electrical Engineers. And we started working a couple of months ago, and we've been busy in several technical investigations that are directed to provide adequate knowledge to support the new build programs in South Africa. For a variety of reasons, the nuclear build programs across the world have slowed down. But today I'm going to talk to you about global progress in large nuclear power plant constructions. As mentioned before, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Melly Thipaza. To kick off the presentation, this thing is not moving now. Looks like we've got some challenges here. Okay. Right. The focus of my presentation is on large nuclear power plants. And to kick off the presentation, I will talk about the current large nuclear power plant build options and experience. And basically here, what we are talking about is who is building and how are they doing. And then the follow-up to that, then I'll look at the key learnings on the standardized series construction. And basically, I'll be showing you some curves with respect to learnings and localization. And then following that, there will be maybe 2 slides on the work experience, world experience on tariffs with nuclear programs. And here I'll be showing world experience on world tariffs on nuclear-based tariffs with others. Basically, the silent features of nuclear that you are probably more concerned with most of the time are actually, in my opinion, resolvable or resolved. We mostly concern ourselves with the issues that I've indicated on the slide. The first one being nuclear safety. Because we are a highly regulated industry, we always have to ensure that we comply with the regulatory provisions to ensure that there is adequate safety for humans, plant, and environment. But the issue of safety is really a non-issue. If you look at the developments that have taken place within the nuclear industry, because nuclear is one of the safest technologies that you can think of in the world in terms of power generation. And the nuclear is reliable, and it provides a reliable base load, and is dispatchable, and is available 24/7. And when it comes to economics, we are well versed in terms of the costing and the prices of nuclear. As Dave has just presented to you now, you can see how that nuclear professionals actually understand there's a good grasp of economics around the world, and wealth of knowledge exists in terms of pricing and costing of nuclear. But the people who are anti-nuclear will always tell you that nuclear is expensive. But maybe it's our fault we're not bringing up this information at the forefront. And then the other issue relates to emergency preparedness, which is also a done deal because we are making better strides moving forward and with improvements in technology. And the licensability is no issue. And the other issues that might be coming forth relate to funding options, plant life extensions, and the radioactive waste management. But none of these issues are not resolvable. It's the issues that we are grappling with, and we've got solutions for them. Okay, if I can move on to the next part before I get to the core of the presentation. I just want to give a brief outline of the landscape of different energy, different sources of electricity production around the world, but using France as a typical example. I know it was presented in the previous presentation. You will see that if you look in the period between 1960 up to 2012, the French power generation was predominantly hydro and coal. And then in the mid-60s, then there was a slight movement towards oil, source of production of electricity. And then in the mid-70s, nuclear started to feature in. And then around the 80s, there was a significant revolution whereby they brought in a number of nuclear reactors. That is the green color that you see there. And then that led to a significant reduction in hydro and coal production. And then beyond 2012, according to the studies from the World Bank, you will see that nuclear now constitutes more than 70% of energy production in France. Okay, where am I going with all of this? And then let's look at the evolution of nuclear reactors. You will see that in the early 50s, between the 50s and the 1960s, then we had the early prototype reactors, which was called is known as Generation 1, but this is not a formal nomenclature, but we normally use this to identify the different types of reactors in this generation, the technologies. And then these were predominantly shipping port, the submarines, and the Dresden reactors and the Magnox in the UK. And then after that, we moved to have the first commercial reactors between in the 1970s, moving to the 90s. That was known as a Gen 2. Those are typically the light water reactors, the PWRs, the BWRs, the VVRs, including the CANDUs. And then somewhere there, I think around 1979, then we had one of the first famous nuclear incidents. Not that it was major, but many people make a big deal out of it. I think around 1979, the TMI happened, but there were no deaths that were related, nuclear related, that were reported in that incident. And then ever since then, there have been continuous improvements with the themes on safety, economics, and waste management. So then we moved on to have Generation 3, and we're now at a point where we are talking about Generation 3 plus, which are evolutionary reactors offering improved economics. And beyond the 2030s, we're looking at the small reactors, which are Gen 4 reactors. But these are at this point in time at conceptual phases, and some of them are developing prototypes and demonstration plans. And these will turn out to be even more safer than what we have seen in the past. Okay, then if you look at the global trends, then who is building and where? Then this slide here, this slide and the following slide give us a snapshot of the contracts that have been placed around the globe and the value of the contracts between 2009 and 2016, more or less. And most of these contracts are typically EPC type contracts. And then, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, you will see there that Egypt was one of the countries that are venturing into nuclear in Africa, with the 4 VVR reactors and Adaba at a contract price of 28.75 billion. And the other one that would probably attract our attention would be the one at Abu Dhabi, where the Koreans signed a contract in 2009 for 4 reactors at Baraka. And that one is probably maybe closer to us because it resulted into some brain drain at Quebec. And we've lost a number of operators and other technical professionals that went into the project, but it's good for the world of nuclear, and it's good for development, and hopefully those people will come back and be of value to our nuclear program when and if it takes off. And then the other one that maybe I've just used it as an example is the one at Kandakulan in India. And all these contracts basically were signed on a certain date as indicated, but the actual work started maybe some 2-3 years later. Okay, and I just made some notes here to indicate that the World Nuclear Experience, from the data that are gathered from these contracts, indicates that nuclear costing is actually well understood. And as you will see in the next slide, the overnight cost, that is in dollars per kilowatt, vary based on the nature of the contract. And for Kandakulan, as an example, you'll find that that overnight cost is in the region of 2,700, whereas for El Dabaa in Egypt, it would be in excess of 6,000, whilst Bangladesh would be around 4,500. But India has got 4 units on one side. Maybe that's why the cost is a bit lower. And Egypt might look expensive, but it's because, amongst other things, is that it includes a desalination plant with a capacity of 680 megaliters per day, which is far much greater than the demand, the water demand in Cape Town. Okay, and the Bangladesh contract does include the first fuel loading and the Russians operating the plant before they hand over. And I think they would be operating the plant for a period of about a year before they hand over to the people of Bangladesh. Okay, but what do we learn from all of these contracts? I think from what I've said so far, from what I've presented up to this slide, I think the key question for the South African program is what is the marketplace real cost of new build program, and what are the funding options that we have? I know we've made a number of strides, and we went through the RFI exercise under the coordination of the DMRE, and I hope that the outcomes of that will come and inform us as to which approach to take. I was heavily involved in that, leading the technical team that did the evaluations, but I think I cannot really comment on that at this point in time, up until we have received a word from the department. Okay, and then this other slide is basically the same thing as I have shown in the previous slide, and it's the interpretation of public data from the World Nuclear News. Same material, but presented in a graphical form. And there might be slight discrepancies because here they even show the interest during construction. And then in the other slide, we're just showing what was the value of the contracts. And then I think the other key point to take away is that most of these contracts are actually with the Russians. And then it also shows here the overnight costs, which was not shown in the previous slide, but I've already commented on this. And then moving forward, this slide shows the impact of standardized fleet practice. And then in this case, we're having 2 examples, the Chinese example, but from the Chinese General Nuclear Power Company, the impact on localization process. And then the other one is from the Korean exercise, which is the overnight interest rate, basically. And then if you look at the first graph, you'll find that you've got 5 projects that are indicated in there. And then the first 3 projects are the 2-pack stations, and then the last 2 indicate 4-pack stations. And then the localization process, or the outcomes of localization from a standardized build, starting with the first 2 first of a kind. What was realized there was 1%, but by the time you get to the 4-pack station at the end, the localization that was achieved is even greater than 85%. So basically, what this graph shows you is that the more we repeat the same of a standardized works, we accumulate more skills, and the economies of scale give us a greater benefit, and hence we have more localization in there. And then if you come to the South Korean cost of overnight interest, which is the lending rate between the financial institutions, you'll see here they make an example of 5 projects per se. And then the first project and the third project are basically probably on the same side, but it's the first 2 units and then the subsequent 2 units. And then the second project and the fourth project are also similar. It's the first 2 units and then the subsequent 2 units. And then there you can see that the interest rate goes down from the first of kind, from 100% to you have a reduction of about 18% to the second similar project. That is from project 1 to project 3. It's about 18% reduction in interest rate cost. And then between project 2 and project 4, you have another 12% reduction. And then project 5 being a different project amongst these the ones that I've already talked about. There you went down to 77, 79%. So it is expected that the next project, whether it's on a different site or it's a subsequent project, it's an extension of an existing project, that interest rate is expected to go down because of the standardized design, which will have matured as you go along. And then the same projects are taken, and then in the next slide, you will find that here we are trying to study the same, basically the impact of the standardized construction, the impact of repetitive construction on a standardized plant. And here, what we're trying to show is the effect on the cost of construction as a percentage of first of the kind. So the first, bearing in mind that the first project and the third project are similar projects, the other one is the follow-up of the other, and the second and the fourth is the same as is in the previous slide. We are able to, the Koreans were able to achieve a cost reduction of up to 37% over a period of about 15 months. And then the construction duration also decreased from, was reduced from 64 to 47 months, with a target in year X or year N of going down to 39 months. So the point in case here is that if you have a standard design that is licensed, and then you accumulate more skills and you become more competent in terms of doing the works, and then as a result, you perform better, and then you reduce the cost, and then you also reduce the construction time. Okay, moving to the next slide. As you would be aware that as part of the lean manufacturing, I think modular construction approach is one of the things that is being talked about nowadays. And then here we have a sample or a study of a modular construction approach that was adopted in Ohio, electric boat manufacturing. And then here there was a steady production rate of one boat per year over 18 years. And then when they applied this modular construction approach, there was learnings that were achieved, and then it was expressed in terms of, it was quantified to have been about 86% learnings. And then the performance improved, as you can see from this inverse relationship. the production hours hyperbolically decreased from 100 to about 50. So the point in case here is that with modular construction, you can do much better. And if we apply the same techniques in the construction of a nuclear power plant, then we would be able to reduce the construction times and effectively the cost. And then moving on to the world experience on nuclear construction. Here there's a study that was done. Okay, this is information that we got from the CB Insights, and then it's information based on different countries, including China, France, the UK, and the US, and South Korea. And unfortunately, Japan and the Russians are not part of the study. And the study looks at collected data in the period 1955 to 2015. And what we're trying to look at here is the ability of the different vendors or vendor countries to complete different projects of different nuclear projects of different sizes, of different magnitude, over a period. And then the criteria that is being used here is to say that projects of about 500 megawatts would be considered to be small projects, and 5 times that would be a medium-sized project, and then large projects would be in the region of 15 times the original, the smaller projects. And so you can see in the legend the different globes that are used to indicate what is a large project and what is a small project. And then in the plot that you see, you will find that in the early ages, we were basically involved in smaller projects and medium-sized projects. And then because we did not have enough experience in what we were doing, we were sort of staggering in below 5 years for small projects, around 5 years. But within the red line block that is shown around 1975 and beyond, you will find that the countries that are predominantly able to complete projects of any size, from small to major projects, have predominantly been the Koreans and the Chinese. And the rest of the other countries actually fall outside that window. And these countries, for smaller projects, they would take in the region of about 3 years to complete. Maybe for major projects, then they go up to 8 years. So what we take from this is that the Chinese and the Koreans, according to this CB Insight, the data that has been mined from these studies, indicates that the Chinese and the Koreans are actually leading the pack. I cannot comment about the Russians because the Russians were not actually part of the study, but from the other projects that I've seen, I think they have also not been doing terrible bad. Sorry, not extremely bad. Okay, when it comes to the tariffs, here you got a study that was done by Trinonics, VB, for the European Union in 2018. But in any event, that's the latest study that I could find, and I think it's still valid. This study is about energy prices, the costs, subsidies, and their impact to industries and the household. And then it's in euros. The tariff is in euros per megawatt hours, and it shows the different countries here. And as you can see, the spending from Brazil to Saudi Arabia, the cost in Brazil are sky high. And then for 28 European Union countries, the average is above 100 per megawatt hour. And South Africa features there after Mexico is the red there, which is about 60 euros per megawatt hour, which translates to about 1 rand per megawatt hour. And you would recall that at some point in time, South Africa was the lowest cost producer of electricity. But now things have changed, but South Africa doesn't feature that badly if you look at this graph. And as a follow-up to this graph, there's another study that was done by World Energy Council in 2018, and this one is in dollars per megawatt hour, and it shows pretty much the same picture. And here South Africa is featuring at about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, so that's it in as far as I can share with you with respect to the tariffs. And then just to conclude my presentation, I've put together some closing remarks based on the information that we have gathered and the other studies that we are doing. But the intent of today basically was to say to you that nuclear is a viable option. And besides the upheavals of nuclear build programs around the world for a variety of reasons, there are some contracts similar contracts that have been placed over the past 10 years. And I'm not here to paint a rosy picture of nuclear, but rather to present facts. And I know that some people would rather focus on the downside. And nuclear has got its own challenges. It is true that nuclear has got its own challenges, but there are some good things that are happening with the nuclear. And there is no reason why we should not support the strategic direction that is being taken by the government and push nuclear as one of the viable energy sources that are cheap, that will foster economic growth in this country. So basically, in terms of my global remarks, I would say that there is global evidence, significant global evidence for large nuclear new build programs since 2009 that I've shown you in the slide. And then the only thing that South Africa needs to do is to determine the real cost of a nuclear build program and the suitable funding options to take the program forward. And then I've also shown you through the graphs and the cartoons that I've shown you that there are benefits in the standardized series construction with respect to cost, localization, construction times, and some learnings and so forth. And then in addition, I would like to say that modular construction process provides enhanced learnings and performance. And you will not be able to implement a successful nuclear program without a massive skills development. This is an essential element of any build program in the industry development. And I would also like to say that the licensing of a conventional nuclear power plant with a reference plant actually should be a no-brainer, because everything is there, everything is established. And then as long as you know all the rules and then you comply with the statutory requirements, then you should be fine. And then on that note, that's where I end my presentation. And then I will take questions after that. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Melly. Melly's been talking about the conventional what we're now called conventional nuclear plants. Almost sounds like an oxymoron, which is a Coburg type large reactors. Next speaker is going to be Peter Fenter, who's the Vice President of MOR Technologies, which stands, I think, for Modular Reactors. I'm sure Peter will correct me if I'm wrong. At USNC, which stands for Ultra Safe Nuclear Company. He's more than 20 years experience in nuclear and power generation. He was the reactor unit system engineer developing the PBMR 400 high temperature gas cool reactor for direct Brayton cycle in South Africa, and later the overall plant lead engineer for the PBMR DPP 200 indirect cycle design. He's also worked for Hatch as an engineering manager in developing large-scale renewable energy projects in South Africa. Prior to joining USNC, he was the manager of engineering and part of the senior management team at Fluor in sub-Saharan Africa, where he's overseen the execution of large EPC projects in the oil, gas, mining and metals and power sectors. So with that, I pass across to Peter. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. Let me just pick up the right screen here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for that introduction, Dave. As Dave said, I work for a US company called Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation. We're a private company that is developing our own technology, which we call a micro-modular reactor technology. So Dave and Melly has been talking about a lot about reactors. I specifically want to focus on a new breed or the next generation of reactors from a technology point of view. They have presented the economic cases and the learnings and history and things like that. But I think some of us may think, or you may have the impression that the nuclear industry is a dying industry, and actually the opposite is true. As a South African, we are quite used to Coburg and seeing the view of Coburg as a large power reactor. That is our reference. And then, as Melly said, there's also a new evolutionary generation 3+ reactor, which is what I call the large advanced reactors here on the right-hand side. But the two that I want to present to you today, which you may have read about in the press, are what is called a small modular reactor. So these are reactors roughly around 60 megawatts of reactor power, and that is compared to a Coburg type reactor of about 1,000 megawatts, or an advanced reactor which can be as large as 1,400 megawatts, as they're building in Abu Dhabi. And then there's also a new type, what is called a microreactor. Now, a microreactor is even smaller. So this is typically a reactor of less than 20 megawatts of thermal energy. And you may ask, but why? And I think there are a couple of things which we have also learned. With large reactors, it is suitable for large deployments on large grids. And that excludes a lot of countries in the world which does not have such a high demand or such large transmission networks to connect a large reactor to. So there is this new breed saying maybe a smaller is also better, or it has its own place. And that's where the small modular reactors and the microreactors are coming in. And let's put that in perspective in terms of how do they compare. So the circles here at the top represents typically the size of a site or the footprint. of what a nuclear reactor requires around it in terms of supporting infrastructure, site infrastructure, and so on. And what you can see is for the large reactors, yes, of course, they require a significantly larger site. And then for the small modular reactors, about 50 acres, and for the microreactors, less than 1 acre. And as I said, in terms of the megawatts of electricity, you can have 1,000+ megawatts on the large reactors. The small modular reactors, 60 megawatts or less, and the microreactors, even less than 20 megawatts. They all use uranium as fuel, but they can have different coolants, whereas most of the large reactors are what we call water-based, so they use water as a coolant. There are different technologies at the smaller range that is being investigated. And then the row at the bottom is talking about what we call an emergency zone. So this is typically the area, how close you can be to a reactor without requiring to be evacuated or sited. Now, why does this matter? And the thing is that the large reactors are usually built close to cooling sources. That is why you find most of the large reactors are situated near oceans or large lakes. Whereas what we're trying to do with the small modular reactors, and especially with the microreactors, is more a distributed generation approach. So the plan there is to put the reactors as close as possible to the load centers. And with the small modular reactors, you can think that a load center may be a city or a very large industry. With the microreactors, we are really targeting the off-grid applications, which is currently served by diesel generators. So this is suitable for remote mines or for remote communities, especially in harsh environments like the Arctic or northern Canada, or areas where you don't have access to electrical networks that you can plug into. Now, the smaller emergency zone combined with the smaller footprint means that we can site these reactors much closer to the mine or where the energy is required. And I'm specifically talking about energy, and I'll come back to that. So let's just look at why. What is different, or what are the benefits of these small modular reactors? So the first thing is that they are smaller and they are inherently designed to be modular. So this means that most of the components of these reactors can actually be built in a factory off-site. And then the modules are transported to site and they are just assembled on-site. Now, why is that a good idea? I think what we have seen, as Melly has presented here, is that the biggest, I would say, risk on a large nuclear project is actually the construction time on site. That's where most of the cost overruns and delays happen to various reasons. And as Melly showed you, the more times you do it, the better you get at it. But as most of you know, that when you are dealing with changes on a site, on a construction site, it is expensive and it can cause significant delays. So the premise here is that if you can assemble or build these modules in a factory environment where you have got better control, it results in better quality and more standardization. And this means that combined with the smaller output of these reactors, they are really suitable for countries with smaller grids or smaller demands that would not have the option of deploying 1,000 megawatt reactor or two in terms of their grids. I am a technical specialist with the International Atomic Energy Agency as well, advising many of the member states in the IEA on deploying SMRs. And these are new countries who is looking at nuclear for the first time. But their needs is in the 200 megawatt range, the 300 megawatt range. They don't need 1,000 megawatt range. And that means the size and the construction efficiency hopefully also helps to easier financing for these kind of plants, unlocking lower rates, as Dave has shown. And really what we are chasing here are the economies of series production. So it's different to the economies of scale, where the nuclear industry traditionally has moved to build the reactors bigger, generate more power. What we are exploring is a concept of saying the more of the same thing we can produce, the lower we can get that cost. And this is the area where this new generation is less reliant on active safety systems, things that must work or pumps that must come on, which requires backup power and things like that. So this new generation is really embracing the concept of inherent safety coupled with passive safety systems. So things that rely on natural convection or gravity or things like that, instead of a whole series of backup generators that needs to kick in to provide the backup power. Of course, because it's so small, it also leads itself to be situated below ground. So there's the potential for burying these reactors below ground. And you may ask, well, what is the impact of that or the benefit of that? And this helps to protect the reactor against natural or man-made hazards. So you can think of seismic events or tornadoes or aircraft impact. By burying it below ground, you have a natural protection against these hazards as well. And then, of course, the premise is that it is also modular in the sense that you can scale them. If you need a larger output on a site, you just have more units assembled together on a site instead of scaling up the reactor all the time. And then I think a very important aspect, which brings me back to a point I made earlier about the siting. These smaller reactors also lends itself to different cooling arrangements, where you can use air cooling or less water cooling. So that means that they are suitable for arid and water scarce regions, typically like we have in South Africa and in many other places in the world as well. You would be surprised to discover, of course, that similar dynamics that we see, for example, in North Canada, where we are working, we see in Africa, we see in island states, where they all have got a need for low carbon power at an affordable price, but they can't afford such big stations as we've been talking about before. And they also have got very specific areas where it needs to be sited. You can think of in the Middle East, as Melly said, the cost of desalination is very expensive. So these are the kind of options that we are investigating from a technology point of view. I talked about energy and not just power, because in this technology space, our market that we are chasing here is not just providing electricity, but it is also providing energy to industrial facilities. And what I'm showing you here on the slide are the different technologies listed at the top. So these are all different kinds of reactors, which gives you different temperatures or different powers or different ways of operation. And then here at the bottom, you can see a temperature scale just showing you the different industrial processes and the types of temperatures they require, and how these reactor technologies can map to providing what we call process heat, also to industrial facilities. Now, this can range from district heating or desalination, all the way to providing or generating hydrogen from various chemical processes. So it's important to see here, and you can imagine that if you have a facility that produces hydrogen, then it doesn't make sense to have a nuclear reactor that is 1,000 kilometers away and you can only get electricity from it. You would need a reactor, or you would like a reactor that you can site close to your facility and get a pipeline of high temperature heat that you can use in your process itself. Now, I'm saying that there's a quiet revolution going on in the world. And what I'm showing you here is a world map of all the different designs, designs that is being developed by different or in different countries all over the world. And what you can see is that this is a sort of a global phenomenon. So there's a lot of activity in North America. There's some activity in South America. In South Africa, I think most of you are well aware of the PVMR project that we had in South Africa. And I want to stand still there and I say, I want to be as bold as saying that the PVMR project was the grandfather or the impetus to all of this development going on in the world here. Back in the day when we were working on the PVMR project, nobody believed that you can design a reactor that is so small and still be competitive and be versatile in terms of what you can provide. And slowly but surely, we started to show that it is possible by participating in programs in the US, by working together with China, and obviously with the originators from Germany as well. And this is now snowballed into a global phenomena where the East is developing, Europe is developing, Russia is developing. So this is truly a global competition from our perspective that is happening here. And what I'm showing you here are just some of the technology companies involved in this global competition, as I put it. And what is interesting here is that all of a sudden, because it's smaller, it is more affordable in terms of your capital required, your development costs required, that all of a sudden you see a lot more private companies. You see a lot more startup companies being involved in this and being funded through private investors. So most of these startup companies all have got some venture capital or investors behind them to develop their technologies and to deploy them. So what you are seeing here is that it's not the domain of large state-owned enterprises anymore. It's not the domain of only government funding. It's not the domain of large public companies only. The company that I'm working for, Ultra Safe Nuclear, is in here, and I also recognize a lot of our competitors. Now, talking about government support, this isn't just an opportunity that we see as industry. This is also an opportunity that a lot of the governments see, and they are putting a lot of serious money encouraging and supporting these developments, either in country or supporting the companies that represents them. So if you look at the United States, at the end of last year, they have announced a competition for the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program for 2 US teams to construct an SMR within the next 7 years. They have also put funding to 5 US teams to develop the technology that can be deployed in the next 10 to 14 years. And then I think a big indicator to us in the nuclear industry as well is that they have initiated reforms in their nuclear regulator to allow for all these different advanced reactors, all the different technologies. They all work on different principles. So you can't just have a set of regulations that is suitable for water reactors and apply it to all the other different types. In China, they have built the HDR-10 with the help of Germany originally, and they have just completed the HDR-PM project, which is similar to the PBMR project. And then they have also developed their own small modular water-based reactor that they have now deployed. And in the United Kingdom, there's the Advanced Modular Reactor Program for 8 teams performing feasibility studies of how advanced reactors can be used both for power or process heat or hydrogen production in the UK. And there's been awards for British companies to develop advanced manufacturing techniques for SMRs as well. So they are really supporting their manufacturing industry to get involved and become leaders in producing these factory-built reactors. In Russia, you may have seen they have developed a Barge-based nuclear power plant, which means that they can tow it to wherever they need it. And then they also have got a lead bismuth project, the Brest 300, which has recently gone into execution as well. In Canada, they have also changed their regulations to allow for vendor design reviews. And the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, which is the equivalent of NEXA in South Africa, has launched a competition to cite a demonstrator on their site. They received 19 responses, and maybe a bit of advertising. Our company was the one that won that competition. So this is where we are currently licensing and planning to build our first demonstrator in Canada. They have launched the Canadian Nuclear Research Initiative, which is a joint R&D fund between government and industry. And the government themselves has launched their own SMR roadmap of how they see SMRs being deployed all over Canada going forward. Now, looking at some designs, this is the stuff that excites me. And what I'm showing you here is a whole bunch of different designs, all using water as a coolant. So you can see different sizes. Each one of these are presented by a different company. So what you can take from this is that there are design teams similar to ours working actively on performing the design and turning them into demonstration projects every day all over the world. If you look at the marine-based water-cooled reactors, there is the Barge-based nuclear power plant I was talking about from Russia. So this isn't just a graphic, this is a photo of the completed plant. But you can also see that they are developing designs of how to power ships or offshore platforms with small nuclear reactors. Now, these are just the designs for water. Now, you can also use gas like helium, or you can use molten salts as a coolant, so instead of the water. And these are all the designs that people are working on, using these kind of coolants. And I think here the ones I want to highlight is, again, there's a photo of the HDR PM, which is a twin reactor currently being built in China, based on the pebble bed technology. There's our PBMR design that we developed in South Africa. And there's a whole bunch of designs from the US that was also developed based on mostly what we call high temperature gas cooled reactors using helium. The molten salt reactors are over on this side. There has been some demonstrators built in the past, and people are resurrecting that technology for advanced reactors today as well. One of the things I want to stand still at is, especially on the previous slide, looking at the gas-cooled reactors and the molten salt reactors as well. The one thing that has probably made the biggest impact in the way that we can design the next generation of reactor are the advances in terms of the fuel. And we have got a fuel here. I'm showing you a photo here of a fuel which we call a triso particle. Now, it doesn't matter so much what it stands for, but this is basically about a 1 millimeter diameter particle we are looking at here. In the center, you can see the uranium kernel. So that is the nuclear fuel. And then you will see different layers around that fuel. Now, these are carbon layers or silicon carbide layers, which basically means that it acts as a pressure vessel around this fuel kernel that keeps all the fission products that gets generated, and that's the radioactive material inside. Now, what you then have is you've got thousands of these little particles that you can either put into a pebble, a ball, which is about the size of a tennis ball, or you can put them into compacts, as our company is doing here. And this is our proprietary fuel, where we then go a step further and say that we are taking these triso particles and we're encasing it in a silicon carbide matrix, which really means that these little cylinders are about as hard as a diamond. And this means that your safety starts with your fuel. You remember, contain at the fuel source. So those large containment buildings that you always see around large reactors, well, that gets replaced with these little kernels, I would say. And this is where you can achieve a significant economic advantage, because if your reactor is inherently safe, then you don't need as many safety systems or backup systems or things like that. Now, the one that is dearest to my heart are the micromodular reactors, because that is where I work in every day. That's our little design over there, where you can see we are burying our reactor. We are putting it below ground, and we assemble even our buildings from prefabricated modules. And we are targeting, for instance, to cut down that 4 or 5 year construction period on site for a large nuclear plant. We are targeting a on-site construction period of around six months if we do our job properly. And what you can see here is that there are designs which has got mobile reactors. Now, the big thing is that these reactors are normally sealed. So you fuel them once and then you run them almost like a battery until the energy in the uranium is exhausted. And you can see that there are reactors which is currently under in a licensing process in the US, which delivers about 2 megawatts of electrical power. And this is really focused at remote communities where you have got people who's relying on diesel generators today for their electrical needs. Now, what are the stages of development? Because this is, we always talk about the next generation, but the next generation is always 10 years out. So what is the reality? Now, I think as Melly said, that a lot of these designs are in conceptual design, but then you have got the designs that is moving out of conceptual design and preparing for execution projects. And then you have got designs that are currently in execution. That's the HDRPM project. There's the Carem reactor in Argentina. There's the Barge reactor in Russia. And these two ones I've circled here. Since I made the slide, it has been announced that they have moved into execution as well in Russia and in China. So what you do see is that there is a steady progress of these designs, moving from conceptual design into basic design and then into execution. And this is what we are basically seeing in terms of deployment plans of these SMR projects. The barge base, they have completed commissioning and it is in commercial operation. The HDRPM, I think that they have finished their commissioning now, and we are eager to await startup any time soon. Carem has been on hold in Argentina and are planning to continue with finishing the construction soon, and then starting that up. As I said, the ACP 100 in China, they have announced that they've moved into construction. NewScale is a design in the US. They are busy with their design certification review, so it's the regulatory review of the design. And then the Smart is from Korea, and they have completed their licensing in Korea and are actively talking to potential customers all over the world. So this is a smattering of technology development that is happening all over the world at this point in time. I think especially the news outlets that I'm following, there isn't a day that goes by without a new announcement from one of these companies about either new funding or a new milestone that they have achieved. So this is opening up a whole new range of possibilities of how you can deploy nuclear, even in remote areas and in a distributed fashion. With that, thank you very much. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. We're now into questions. We've as always, good people, enthusiasts have always talked too long. We've got a series of questions I'll go through in some kind of order. People thankfully have said who they're going to. So I'll, if I may, cover a few and then I'll pass across to others. First question from Emmanuel Montewedi is, do you think the current junk credit rating for the nuclear build will still get 3% real interest? As I said earlier, the Egyptians got it, and they're literally a lower junk rating than we are. So I think that the raising the money at that interest rate, it's like borrowing money for your house or for your car. If the interest rate stops at about, let's say, 5% real. Beyond that, no one lends you money at all because it's a bigger risk. So the answer at the moment is we are raising money internationally. The current price of debt in the world is extremely low. In fact, it's negative in most first world countries for very big projects. So yes, it's still quite credible. I'm just going to pick a few questions out. There's a comment from Duncan Ramsbottom, two in fact. One says the CSR is promoting a renewable energy only future in SA. What can be done to get the CSR to consider a nuclear future for SA? I'll be extremely brutal, and the answer is that the reason the lobbyists in general support renewable energy is because they're project sizes which can be done by the private sector, and they can get the sovereign guarantees to provide the income based on output, and therefore they can make money from doing it. So if you're a large investor, you can invest in your wind farm and you can make very good returns on your money. The trouble is that is not a solution to solve the national economy. It's a problem to make money for yourself. So I'm not trying to get the CSR to change their view. They have said regularly that their discount rate is 8.2%. That's what Treasury says, and that's what they're going to use come what may. I don't quite understand that. And I'll just go on one other, then I'll go back to somebody else. William asked two questions very quickly. There's a third question asked, but the Egyptian plant 2016 contract was signed. Several years to get to move from contract signature to finalization often. They have just cleared, they've just submitted the safety case finally to the safety authority in Egypt, and I believe they hope to move on site with bulldozers within the next few months, I believe at the moment. They're planning to be online about 2026, I think. And you also asked a question about load following. Pardon me as my dogs make noise. Pardon. One last question before I pass across to. It is often said that nuclear plants are able to load follow. Which types of plants can load follow and how well do they do so? Nuclear plants can load follow beautifully. I used to run a nuclear submarine when I was a lot younger, and we go from 100% to 0 instantaneously without tripping, and we go from 20% to full power in about a minute. But on a big plant like Coburg can nominally load follow at 5% per minute, which is better than any coal station can do an ESCOM grid. The reason that is not done for nuclear plants is because your fuel cost is so low, you're always the highest on the burn or on the run on the merit order. Essentially, nuclear plants can load follow much faster than a coal station can, and realistically as close to being as fast as a gas turbine can. With that, I'm going to ask just a quick question. And ask questions. Peter, sorry.
Yes, I've got. Sorry, David. I've got a question here from Philip Reunert, who's asking the panel, the three of you, what is the panel's view on obtaining approval in South Africa for an IPP to develop an SMR, and how long would it take to get the go-ahead?
Okay, if it's purely the approval, and I can speak on the NN, the legal approval from the nuclear regulator is independent. It doesn't have any specification of who owns the plant. Only the owner operator must be the applicant. So my answer to that question is there should be no bigger detail. So if someone like USNC wanted to build a nuclear plant in South Africa, given they could provide the financial guarantees required, I don't see any change on the schedule they would achieve. That would be achieved by a state activity. Peter, what's your view?
Dave, I can just say that our project in Canada is an IPP-based project in Canada. So there is good precedent for IPPs owning nuclear power plants as well. As Dave said, there's no objection to that. I think how quickly it can be done is going to be a matter of how good your safety case is presented to the regulator, and how quickly the regulator can review it. What we are doing, and that is why our approach, for example, is to build a demonstrator project first. And part of the demonstration is that the technology is licensable. and then your subsequent projects are more of the same. So we expect that the first project takes longer, and the subsequent project should be then a lot faster because you are building something which has been licensed before.
Thank you. Meili, do you want to comment? Just unmute yourself, please.
And I was saying, I think that Peter and Dave have covered it all. And then,
Excellent.
yeah.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Masego Ernst, who asking, do we see nuclear providing jobs a lot more than renewables? I'm asking this because there could be the support for renewables over nuclear due to the colossal loss in jobs over the last decade and due to the effects of national lockdowns.
I can answer that one very simply, is that this is one of these great statements that's made that has little basis, in my view, in truth, and that renewables make more jobs than nuclear does. Just quoting two studies that were done. There was one done in the Nuclear One EIA by Conningarth economists, which was part of the published EIA documentation for it. It said that for the construction phase over 7 years, to build a nuclear plant would generate about 100,000 jobs a year. And that includes direct, indirect, and induced impacts. There was a study done by KPMG in March 17 on Coburg, looking at 2012 to 2016 of how many jobs they created. And between direct, indirect, and induced, they totaled some 35,000 jobs were created by Coburg. Most of them were induced and indirect. What's interesting, therefore, is if you look at the investing, say, 200 billion in a twin unit nuclear station, sort of Coburg lookalike, according to those studies, which certainly in terms of the EIA one, it was peer reviewed. The KPMG one wasn't explicitly peer reviewed, but it's been with domain. You're looking at something like over a 20-year period, 1.1 million job years, which is the buzzword everyone quotes. So to answer that question in a very different way is, the evidence indicates that nuclear creates better industrial jobs than renewables. And I will challenge anyone to go down to Cape or Cape St. Francis, where Coburg, where the next nuclear site was one time was planned to be, and look at the renewable wind turbines there, which is wonderful and they're lovely, I'm sure. There's been no economic impact in the area of any kind from installing those wind farms. The roads haven't been fixed. The unemployment is still terrible. And yet, if we put a nuclear plant in that area, we'd have put something like 20 billion rand of investment into that Munich. That's a different world. So I think nuclear makes far more jobs than renewables do.
Yeah. I'll just like to add, if I can just add to what Dave is saying. We actually also did our own studies during the nuclear one. And we actually found that during the peak construction, they would be creating in the region of about over 30,000 jobs, actually. And during operations, we'll be looking at about, for a twin station, we'll be looking at about 1,700 jobs. And some of these jobs are not necessarily directly in the operations or in the maintenance of the nuclear power plant itself, but they are somewhere in the supply chain and other support functions that are required to get the nuclear program going. So the whole industry, the steel industry, roadworks, the harbors, etc., will benefit from a nuclear program. The schooling system everywhere, in the skills development and everywhere, and even in the building and catering industry. So I don't know much about any studies that have been done that refute that, or anything that has come from the that proves that the renewables would actually provide more jobs than nuclear. I can speak for nuclear, and I know that for its effect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melly. Peter?
Thanks. I would encourage anybody who is interested in learning more about this to study the example of South Korea, where after the Korean Wars, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world with almost no natural resources. And their government made a decision to invest in nuclear. And it's not just to build nuclear power stations, but it was to create a whole industry around that. And I think nobody can dispute the technology leadership role that South Korea is playing in the world today. And that was how a whole country uplifted themselves and became industrial leaders from a nuclear technology that they used to build a whole industry around it. And there's been several good case studies and books written on that if anybody is interested.
Thank you, Peter.
So I just add to Peter's comment. It's worth bearing in mind that the South Korean nuclear build program, which started in the mid-70s, essentially works out at 1 machine a year for about 25 years. And they started out very much behind us in the mid-70s compared to where we were. But the reality is that 1 reactor per year is still markedly less than we need to build to replace the current ESCOM coal fleet with something that actually works. And they started out totally importing everything, no industry, and they ended up 20 years later being an industrial powerhouse in the nuclear field. This concept that says, oh, look at the people who've done it. We're not as clever as the Koreans, or not as clever as the French, or not as clever as somebody else. The answer is, look at when they started, not where they finished. People get very excited about saying, people say, we must buy a nuclear plant from an experienced country. Look at the French, we bought Coburg from the French, and that was an experienced country. And everyone says that. They say they can't trust the Chinese or the Koreans because they're all too new. When we ordered Coburg in 1976, the first nuclear plant in France, Fessenheim, was a year away from commissioning. So we placed the contract for Coburg 1 and 2 when there was not a single similar machine running in France. What was supporting that decision was the 35 machines or something that the French had ordered. So the industry was being created. And it wasn't because French were geniuses, their cheeses proved they had problems there. But essentially it was because if you do it, you're successful. Look at the world today. Melly was pointing out that the people who look at are the Chinese and the Koreans, and I believe the Russians are also good at doing it. And they're not doing it because Chinese and Russians and Koreans are fundamentally clever people, cleverer than us. It's just because they're doing it. The French in the mid-70s to the early 90s were experts at building nuclear power stations, as ESCOM was an expert in building coal stations. We left it 20 years and tried to do it again. It was a disaster. The French are having exactly the same problem now, going from an industry that hasn't built a nuclear station in 15 years to building the new EPRs, and they're having the problems, not the big design problems. These are the fundamental basic issues of constructing large projects. So doing it is the answer, not being a genius. And the Korean example could be replicated here almost to the letter, in the sense that we need about 2 machines a year for the next 20 years. Sorry,
thank you.
Take the rant as a rant.
Yes, our last question quickly. We've got like 2 minutes. It's for Peter. How are banks looking at the industry at the moment? And do you see more appetite as they're forced to move away from fossil fuel funding?
Yes, we were definitely, our MIMA projects are not bank financed yet. So I can give you my perspective from the investment community, similar to where renewable energy projects started off. And there's a significant interest, and there's a lot of money that is being invested and poured into these projects. And we believe that by following a typical power project development route, whereby the technology gets demonstrated, everybody starts to understand the risk, that you can move to a point where these projects, especially the smaller ones, like the ones that we're involved in, can be financed on a project financing basis. That is where we think we can go. And that means that we can, the size of our projects are small enough that commercial banks can get involved in funding these kind of projects, similarly to how the renewable energy projects in South Africa has been funded up to now.
Thank you, Peter. Over to you, Dave.
Right, well, that's the conclusion. I think we run out of time. It is nice to sit here with too many questions to answer, because there's a whole pile more we haven't got to. But I think that it's what we're trying to say today, and what's come out strongly, is that this is an industry which has both a very stable present day situation, and a way forward for the entire spectrum of demands of the power industry, both right down to the company level all the way up to the state level. And it offers a credible alternative for the country to look to, and it is a pity that everybody has this preconception that somehow nuclear is too expensive and it's an ego trip by certain politicians. And I think that we've got to, this webinar was aimed at saying, if the 2,500 megawatts that is down in the IRP to be for the nuclear future, which is logically just post 2030, to be in service, which means they're going to have a contract placed in the next couple of years, is a credible way forward this country to try and address its needs. And in fact, is a better way forward than any other option currently on the table. With that, I think I'll pass back to Minx, and thank you for organizing it, Minx.
It's my pleasure. Thank you to all the presenters and the attendees for today. The questions that we didn't get to today, we will be answered by the presenters, and it will be uploaded on the SAIEE website. Thank you very much for joining us. All have a good day and stay safe. Take care.